Thank you for coming to the Luminary series today. My name's Gary Schindel. I'm the Administrative Vice President of the NSS. And I'm going to go get Dave Hughes, and he's going to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Our speaker today is Dr. Stanley Sides. As one of his many accomplishments germane to caving, Stan was actually the president of the CRF back on a magical day in September 1972 when Mammoth Cave and Flint Ridge Cave were officially connected. Indeed, Stan is the person present on the ridge that very day that was tasked with informing the National Park Service that the longest cave in the world had been created. In addition to his knowledge of Mammoth in particular, Stan is also an expert on the human and cultural history of a number of caves on the ridge. In fact, he has researched, written, published, lectured, and taught extensively on that subject for literally decades. Moreover, Stan is an expert on a number of the caves in the more local region of Missouri, and I anticipate that he will regale the audience with several of those stories this afternoon. Distinguished gentleman, terrific friend, respected medical professional, and a truly great guy, please welcome your 2015 NSS Luminary, Dr. Stan Sides.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Gary. Thanks to the whole society for this opportunity. It's quite a privilege to be declared a luminary after all these years of caving. There comes a point in your cave career that you recognize that you have a lot more caving yesterdays than caving tomorrows. So it's always a privilege to have a chance to go back and look at what did this all mean? Why did you do all this? How did you arrive at this point in your career? And how did it develop this way? My parents took us to Mark Twain Cave when I was about 9 years old. A little bit later, driving through St. Louis, I wanted them to stop at Cherokee Cave. I never had that opportunity. But as a Boy Scout at Camp Lewallen in Wayne County, Missouri, there was a beautiful spring that bubbles up in Campsite 2. In the summer, I really looked at that, beautiful watercress around it. Had no idea that winter when we were there on a camporee, I inquired about it. They said, well, that spring comes from a cave, but you can't go in the cave. Well, that didn't work. That night, two of us snuck off with flashlights, and they had put boulders over this entrance to Camp Lewallen Cave. It's never been surveyed. This is Steve, my son, who's here many years later when he was there as a Boy Scout. This is the entrance to Camp Lewallen Cave. So we snuck in the cave, and I was really intrigued by how did this cave form. It had a nice little stream that bubbles out in the campsite. There in Jackson, Missouri, in the regional library, they had two important books, Bretz's Caves of Missouri and The Caves Beyond by Lawrence and Brucker. And no one had checked them out. I checked them out and read them over and over, and trying to determine how the caves were forming. And not long afterward, as a sophomore, I started working in a local, small little local market. And I would ask people, do you know of any caves on your property? I'm looking for caves. And a marvelous family named Turner up just south of the town of Oak Ridge, they had an orchard. And Mr. Turner or Mrs. Turner said, oh yes, we have a cave on our property, and boy, you can sure come up and look at it. Well, the Turner's cave were several little holes on the bluff, but we looked back and rummaging around in the woods, found this hole that dropped down about 20 feet down a very nice walking cave. So back in these days, you went to Albert Sander Hardware, and you got the best 8 cents a foot Manilla barn rope. And so you could get, for an outlay of $4, you could get 50 feet of cave rope. This is the way the cave looked inside. Nice walking cave with a beautiful stream going along, and many pink planaria isopods and amphipods. I wrote the cave, we surveyed the cave, I wrote it up as a science project. Back then, when you talk about vertical work, about the only way to get equipment was to join REI in Seattle. So I have an early number, 38913. Back then we could order through the mail and get carabiners and the things we needed. And of course we could get locally the Manilla barn rope. Not long afterward, my sister married a young man from Perry County, Missouri. And he told us, in asking Al, told us that, yeah, his relatives had some caves around on their property and nearby. So I proceeded to get friends to drive us up there, and we looked at several of these caves, especially one named Sail Cave. Nearby, we heard of a cave that was right next to the road. They had bridged the road just a little bit. You can see the Manilla rope laying here. We all got poison ivy. This drops down about 40 feet. It's a nice little bit of cave. We didn't push it, not knowing that years later this would be part of the 15-mile long and entrance into the Rimstone River system. Now, ham radio plays a role in all this. Early on, beginning at age 14, I was a ham radio operator, and most of my friends interested in science were also amateur radio operators. And one of the hams was in the dormitory at Southeast Missouri State University, and I would talk to him, Lynn Papin, at night, and he told me that he had gone to a cave north of Perryville. He had 2 other people with him. The others couldn't get through a very tight crawl in the back of it, so they came out. He had squeezed through, and he thought the cave continued. So I said, well, I'll get another ham, Ron, W0PLW, and we will go with you, and we'll go through that. Well, we got there, and several hundred feet in the cave. As you go in the cave, there are all these deeply incised sort of meanders. We named it Crevice Cave. We got to the end, and boy, that was a tight crawl. We managed to squeeze through, and a little bit further, big walking canyon. We climbed down the far side. Now, this slide was taken a little later. On the far side, we ended up walking a half mile or more in totally virgin cave. A lot of speleothems, side passages coming in, and today this is the state's longest cave, Crevice Cave. We started surveying it, but really didn't know why. But then in October of 1960, one of the Southeast Missouri State University was developing a grotto, and we as high school kids would go over to their meetings. One of the cavers was coming to the MVOR, Mississippi Valley Ozark Regional Convention of the NSS. Was coming to the MVOR at Rock Bridge, south of Columbia. So we ended up being driven up with this college guy to this MVOR. Now, there are 35 people there. And at the time, we were thinking, golly, these are getting big. What are we going to do about the size of MVORs? Jerry Vineyard, Ed Langbrode, Tex Yoakum, Barb MacLeod, Dave Webster, they were all there. It was, I think, Jerry Vineyard that gave up he had a raft, basically, of inner tubes, but he broke it up and gave we that had no inner tubes so we could go in the Devil's Icebox. Spent the day in the Devil's Icebox. That next day, Barb MacLeod, she's a high school student at the time. She'd also be, at this point, a high school senior. Tex took us up the Rock Bridge, and with his also Manilla rope, taught us how to rappel, showed us the basics of prusicking up a Manilla rope. and basically taught us vertical techniques. Dennis Drum and Barb and myself, several others, we ended up learning how to rappel. Now, meeting Tex and the others led me to keep writing Tex afterward. Very, very interesting, a man very interested in people, also fascinated by the caves. So I wrote him, and they were going to be up there surveying in Perry County in December, so I went up, got time off work at the supermarket, and met them and started surveying with them the right-hand lower passage in Tom Moore Cave. Tom Moore Cave at the time was about a 2.5 mile long system. This is an entrance we don't use. This is sort of the overflow floodwater entrance where a stream running off the sandstone meets the Joachim Dolomite and quickly heads underground. This is the main entrance. You climb down 15 or 18 feet. Easy climb down immediately into very nice walking passage. Now that spring, we had the next MVOR, and Dennis Drum, a boy from Cape Girardeau who I met, and he was an NSS member also. He and I were the only NSS members in the Missouri listing in that area at the time. That spring, we all went to Dubuque, Iowa on the MMV Middle Mississippi Valley Grotto bus, went up to Crystal Lake Cave in Dubuque, Iowa. It was memorable. Of course, Dennis and I are still in high school. It was memorable because they took off the bus ride, and there were no interstates then. Took off, and increasingly, as we would go through the night, they would stop and get more beer. And by the time we got close to Dubuque, whenever the bus driver would brake, all these beer cans and bottles would roll forward when he'd take off. It was all this sound made it hard to sleep. It was really a bus afflicted by empty containers. We learned a lot about caving in Iowa because we got there like at 3 or 4 in the morning, and slept in a pavilion with wide spacing between the boards. And we woke up and it had snowed. Oh, we froze. But Stu Peck, we met Stu Peck, a young man interested in biology, and others. That day we went to, at the time, the state's longest cave, Munster Cave, as well as that evening Crystal Lake Cave. Langbrode was there with his wife, Tex, a nice group of MMV Grotto members. SEMO Grotto was just a fledgling group at that point. Well, Jerry Vineyard talked Dennis and I into hosting the next MVOR of all things. Here we're just beginning college students, we're college freshmen, in Perry County at Tom Moore Cave, because these people wanted to see Tom Moore Cave and Crevice Cave. So here are the cars parked in the field there at Tom Moore Cave. The interesting group of people includes Stu Peck, who had hitchhiked all the way from Iowa. Tex Yoakum. Langbrode's over here. From this angle, it's a little hard to make out more, but this was the fine group of cavers, and 60 people showed up. And we thought, boy, MVORs are getting just too big and getting hard to manage. I led trips into Crevice Cave. Stu Peck was fascinated by all the pink planaria in the cave. And so I led there, and Tex and others led trips into Tom Moore Cave. That in the middle of the night, Friday night, one thing that happened was the MSM, that is the Rolla Spelunker group, came, and at that time, Rolla had about 3,000 guys at their engineering school, and about 20 girls. And you notice there's one girl here. And they arrived in the middle of the night, so she laid her sleeping bag down, and the others surrounded her. And when we woke up in the morning, there are these people crawling out with no tents, crawling out of their sleeping bags, trying to wake up and get going to go caving. MMV was spending a great deal of time. Now, You'll see a transition in the slides. Up to this point, I only had a cheap black and white camera. On my high school senior trip in May of 1961, I ended up buying a cheap 35 millimeter camera, and the rest of the slides will now be color. This was typical MMV camp while we were surveying the Tom Moore Cave. Don Stokes is standing there in his flashy underwear. The president of MMV, Steve Sabo, is here sound asleep on the ground. He's not passed out. He didn't drink. This was the way we camped. It was very social. You'd go in the cave, you'd come out fairly early, you'd clean up a little, you'd go to a local tavern. Tex would play guitar. He had taught Barb to play guitar, taught me somewhat to play guitar. He had played music on one of the radio stations in St. Louis for many years. He was an endless supply of songs. So it was always very social in the evening. Songs, burgers in local taverns, all of us having a great time. Now, when you came out, again, there are no interstates yet, and when you came out of the cave on Sunday, you had to clean off, and nearby was Little Saline Creek. So people would proceed to swim in the creek. Dennis Drum, Tex Yoakum here with his hat, Jim Arrigo, who may be here, Steve Sabo, Tex Yoakum's dog, Little Bit. The name and the dog found in the deepest at the time cave in Missouri, Little Bit Pit, was named for that dog. At this time, we had Crevice Cave of unknown length. We had Tom Moore Cave of several miles, several caves south of Perryville. But then after that MVOR in September of 1961, we had another trip in October in which I met the MMVers, Tex and the others. Tex and Lang Brode had plotted their passages of Tom Moore Cave on an aerial photograph. They knew where the cave stopped, and there were no surface expressions, no springs, no evidence of the water coming back out on the surface from the major stream in Tom Moore Cave. So we knew the cave had to continue. The resurgence, we thought, was still several miles away at Blue Spring. So with that, we just drove on Sunday. Everyone was ready to go back to St. Louis. Dennis and me go back to Cape Girardeau to the south. As we're walking through the woods, most people were going back to their cars. It was 2:30 in the afternoon. And Lang Brode and I walked just a little further into the woods, away from where the others were in basically a barnyard area. And I found a little obscure hole. It's the kind of hole normally you'd walk right by. Pulled out some branches and some fill, and it was quite a blast of air. I squeezed in and kicked my legs around, saw that it looked like it continued. So I asked Lang to go back and get some helmets. On the way, he found Tex and sent Tex. So Tex, soon followed by Steve Sabo. Notice we weren't going caving, we just have t-shirts. We all went in. I crawled on in the room inside. Tex, Steve, and I went back toward Tom Moore Cave in this passage. The others found the main part of the cave. We were heading back to Tom Moore Cave. Not far beyond, and these were pictures taken that day, we discovered Berome Moore Cave, now an 18-mile long cave system. I just happened to have my senior trip camera with me and some slide M5 bulbs, and these were the pictures of virgin Berome Moore Cave on the day it was discovered. Tex in the front, here Lang behind him. Big, big cave. So we were off and running, but then about 4 o'clock we're running around in the cave, and we decided, some of us are getting low on carbide. We started asking, Tex, do you have any carbide? Notice no one has packs. Lang, do you have any carbide? None of us had enough carbide. We were lucky to all make it out on the amount of carbide that we had. We had enough light, but we suddenly were struck by the fact that none of us had 2 sources or 3 sources of light. About 2 weeks later, Tex had been obligated to go to Fisher Cave the following weekend. 2 weeks later, we went back. Here's Jack Palmer looking back toward Tom Moore Cave, maybe a mile back to the southwest. Here's the entrance there, the way it looked after we'd been in and out of it a couple times. Today, it's quite a large entrance, and it's the Berome Moore Cave is now well protected. The entrance is well protected due to the Hoff family. Base camp for years was a place that scouts could spend the night in a camp and see a lot of upper level dry passages. Pictures before we MMV Grotto put in sort of the campsite there. Now, Barb was around for none of this because in September 1961, she went to Antioch College at Yellow Springs, Ohio. She did spend time with us as we were surveying Tom Moore Cave, but back then MMV trips were highlighted by the number of guitars that would end up on a grotto trip. Here's Dorothy Staid, and here's probably Texas guitar, and Barb with her guitar. And so there was always a lot of great music on these trips. As you know, Barb has distinguished herself with her songwriting and singing at NSS conventions and CRF get-togethers. Now, this is a year later. I went to college at Southeast Missouri State, there at Cape Girardeau near Jackson, where I was living at the time. Dennis lived at Drum, also lived at Cape. I was not going to become a physician. That was not at all in my plan. Back then, most of us would stay locally, go 3 years at Southeast Missouri State University in pre-engineering. Then you'd go to Rolla, Missouri School of Mines and Metallurgy, but it's still the state's engineering school. You would go there and you would, after 3 years of pre-engineering, you'd go to Rolla to get your engineering degree, and we all wanted to be electrical engineers. Most of my friends were all ham radio operators. Barb went to Yellow Springs, Ohio, to Antioch College, but she was back for the MVOR in the fall of 1962. And you see what she's doing. We're sitting here waiting to go into Grimzinski Cave. What's she doing? She's playing her guitar. Now, sitting on the top of the hood of Steve Barnett's car is Barb's brother, Ross, who is about 12 years old. Does anyone here remember or know what happened at that MVOR? Dave Hoffman, if you're here, you'll know. In Grimzinski Cave, most of us went into Grimzinski Cave, and the back was a slot to avoid a deep part of the stream, and most of the people stayed high in the slot and coming out. Unfortunately, Ross fell, broke his arm and leg, and on that MVOR, we had to remove him from the cave so Barb and Steve could take him to Rolla and then all the way back to St. Louis. One of the first MVORs in which we had a major injury. Barb had written me that she had met Roger Brucker. He lived in Yellow Springs, Ohio. And that summer, she had gone to Flint Ridge at Mammoth Cave. Barb and I had over and over read The Caves Beyond. We thought we could find our way to Bottomless Pit and Floyd's Lost Passage from reading the book so much. And she told me here before Ross's accident that if I wrote Roger Brucker, I could get to go to Mammoth Cave, to Floyd Collins Crystal Cave, just like her. So I wrote Roger Brucker that I was a caver. I knew Barb MacLeod. She would vouch for me. Could I come and cave at Floyd Collins Crystal Cave? At that time, to drive to Columbia without an interstate took about as long as driving to Mammoth Cave from southeast Missouri. So Roger wrote me a nice letter back and sent me a form that, yes, I could come and cave with Cave Research Foundation at Mammoth Cave, at Floyd Collins Crystal Cave. Well, I got his reply, and then I thought, well, I don't have a car, but Dennis, had a car. So I wrote Roger back, Roger, I don't have a car, but I have this friend, Dennis Drum. And so I got this letter back from Roger. I've preserved it. It just says, Stan, bring drum to Roger. And with that, in December of 1962, the New Year's expedition, about 17 of us were in the back house in Speely Hut at Floyd Collins Crystal Cave. I took that same little camera. I happened to catch this picture of Barb MacLeod climbing the ladder up into Smith Avenue from Pole Avenue. I didn't get to go that way. I'm with Joe Davidson, who's on the left, totally upset that I took a camera to take pictures. Here we're eating our, back then you had your fruit cocktail, you had your bone chicken, and I learned to hate bone chicken, and our Vienna sausage. It's Joe Davidson, Walter Lipton, and John Cantwell, who you can see part of studying math at St. Louis University. Well, we're eating here because it's like 5 in the evening, and we haven't even gotten yet to the point we're going to survey. In Missouri, by 5 o'clock, you're out going for burgers and music and beer. And here at Floyd Collins Crystal Cave, we'd gone in like at 9:30. We'd gone all this time, and we're still not to where we're going to start surveying. We surveyed till nearly midnight, and terrible exposure, I thought. Out Ralph's River Trail, out around all these pits. Came out like at 2 a.m. Boy, I was hooked. I had never seen caving like this. The next day, went to Colossal Cave with Bob Keller and John Cantwell and Barb MacLeod in terrible vertical exposure over a place called the Werner Link. And again, exposure in Missouri, you would always try to use some sort of rope. But that's the way it was at Flint Ridge in those days. Now, this is a summer view at the Speely Hut. This was actually the last time that Mickey Starts came. She had advanced breast cancer. She had helped build the Speely Hut in the late 50s. Joan Brucker, Carol Hill, one of the Brucker girls. This is the way in the summer we ate communally at the Speely Hut. The Austin house was closed as far as the commercial cave was closed, and that was a ranger station for the Park Service. This is the way it was also in the summer. John Bridge, now no longer with us. I'm standing here smoking my pipe. The reason I smoked a pipe was in gross anatomy, we had the same cadaver for a full year. And the smell was such that I learned to smoke cherry blend pipe tobacco through a pipe, a Dr. Graybo pipe. I would smoke up my pipe before I went to gross anatomy for a couple hours just to desensitize my nose so I could stand gross anatomy. When I left in 1963, a friend of mine there at Southeast Missouri State convinced me that rather than going to engineering school, why not apply to med school? He was going to med school. Why not apply to med school? So I didn't really want to go to med school, but I took the MCAT, and I ended up being asked to come up for an interview. The day President Kennedy was shot, I drove my girlfriend's car up to Columbia. Her parents wanted her to have it at Columbia. The next day interviewed, and a week later I get this letter saying I'd been accepted to medical school. I really wasn't sure I wanted to do that. All my friends were going to Rolla. They were graduating with electrical engineering degrees. They were driving black Bonneville Pontiacs. If you had one of these black, beautiful Bonneville Pontiacs, you could get a girl. And I'm going to med school, poor. But at med school, for some reason, I got a curator scholarship, so things got a little better. Went to med school, though I really have always been interested in electrical engineering. Before I left Cape, Dave Webster, bless his heart, came to Jackson and sat and typed about 100 cave locations I had in Perry County. He typed them up to turn them into the state. And before I left, here's Tex Yoakum and several of us at an 80-foot pit in Perry County. I've never been back. I don't think it's ever been surveyed. These are the kind of things you sort of leave after years of caving in an area, hoping someone picks up on it. Well, I ended up at University of Missouri, Columbia's School of Medicine. But continued to cave with Shoto Grotto now. This is Gene Hargrove, who wrote one of the first great works in environmental ethics. He and I were studying the Devil's Icebox, trying to figure out how a cave Polly's pot fit in with it. That's him carrying the raft. Here he is rafting into the Devil's Icebox. He and I spent a lot of time. We did just a little bit of dye tracing, my first dye tracing, to prove where Polly's pot connected into the Devil's Icebox. This is Polly's pot. I think it's closed today. This was private then. The apartment I was living in with my roommate, Joe Esmeyer, the women who owned the house where we were in a basement apartment were two of the sisters, the Ingrams, of the family that owned the Devil's Icebox. I had no trouble getting permission to go in the cave. When we came out from cave trips, the sisters always wanted to know, they were in their 70s or more, what we'd found in the Devil's Icebox. Their family owned the Devil's Icebox and the Rock Bridge, which now's Rock Bridge Memorial Park. Jim Houchins, I thought, would be here. This is the Shoto Grotto. We tried new techniques, and here's Jim Houchins showing his hot new, using double brake bars. That's the hot new way. We didn't have racks, showing us the exciting new way to rappel with a figure 8 loop around your waist. Well, I ended up marrying a caver in 1967, and continued to cave, continued to immerse myself in medicine. And Kay and I were married at Columbia. And in the spring of 1968, suddenly I became a doctor. Well, I applied several places for residency and internship. I thought plastic surgery would really be fun, but ended up going in internal medicine. And got to University of Kentucky, left the University of Missouri, moved to Lexington, Kentucky to do internal medicine. Well, there you'd make rounds on Saturdays, so I would, once a month or more, Kay and I would drive down to Flint Ridge, to Mammoth Cave, 2 hours away. But by the time we would get there, the main cave trips would have gone underground. Harold Malloy was commonly there studying history, and he and I spent a lot of time, also Loretta, his wife, and Kay, collaborating on history. He was really specialized in the history of Mammoth Cave before 1850. He always went in the cave with this. He never wore a hard hat. He's an attorney. This is the way he dressed in a cave. He and I got together, and he supplied references. I wrote a paper that was published in the Journal of the History of Medicine in 1971 on the pursuit of health in the Mammoth Cave, the story of the consumptives underground that were put in Mammoth Cave to try to cure tuberculosis in 1842, 1843. Well, back then all doctors had to go in the military. So after 2 years of internal medicine training, Kay thought she'd meet me. I thought I was going to Okinawa. The United States Naval Reserve attached me to the Fleet Marine Force. 2 weeks training at Camp Pendleton, straight to Vietnam. From civilian life, 3 weeks later, Vietnam. Kay moved with David, our oldest son, back to Cape Girardeau near my folks. Now, here's a picture of me with my new boots. I had just gotten their battalion surgeon for the 4th Battalion of the 11th Marines at a place the Lord forgot called Hill 34. Here's Kay about the same time with our little son David on some 19 acres of land we had managed to purchase just at the edge of the park in case CRF had to leave Flint Ridge and move outside the park. You're sort of bored of doing what in combat in a combat situation, you get restless to do things. And not far away, 12, 15 miles, were the caves of the Marble Mountains. I really wanted to go caving. So what I did was one day signed out with our colonel and got 2 riflemen, a corpsman's going to drive the Jeep, and me, and we went to, we tried to get close to the caves at Marble Mountain. We got very close to big, pretty entrances, and we saw what looked like monks going in one of the entrances. And as we're getting out of the Jeep, we're dismounting, going up this big sign, mines. More mines. So we turned around and went back to Hill 34. My operating room, my bunker is deep under my right hand in this picture. Well, David and I, 2 years ago, were in Vietnam, ended up going back, and we had an excellent guide that took us through these. And now what we know today was this was actually a Viet Cong hospital, a secret Viet Cong hospital. This is the way it looks today. So we probably wouldn't have survived our cave trip. I finally left Vietnam. Here I was decorated by the Vietnamese for all the civilians I treated out there. I was only doctor for miles. But notice my smile's gone. The first picture, I'm smiling. Boy, the smile's gone. Headed back to the University of Kentucky and took over after a year at Naval Hospital, Memphis, took over went back to Lexington and became CRF's president. This is the day Kay took this picture as me with my coffee cup, Tommy Brucker, Richard Zopf, Pat Crowther, John Wilcox, and Judy Smith. We learned that they'd found Pete Hansen's signature, and therefore we must have connected. We're on the verge of connecting with Mammoth Cave. John Wilcox is the hardest, the best caver I have ever known. We did other things. Here's Kay in the middle, helping at Pat Watson's archaeology dig. Here's Gordon and Judy Smith with their new daughter, with my little sons. Here, David, and here's Stephen, who's here today. Here's the way we had communal meals. Now we're at the Austin house. Here's Kay feeding Stephen, who's here today. David standing here. Our two sons basically grew up at Flint Ridge. I'm CRF's president. Here's Jack Freeman. We had, a lot of people didn't necessarily like CRF because of our organizational emphasis to get along with the Park Service. Here's Diana Daunt laughing and giggling. Here's Roger Brucker. Here's Red Watson. Here's Roger McMillan. It took this number of people to decide how to move a toilet. Well, we left Kentucky, and I ended up going to Cape Girardeau. My research in coagulation was going to require begging deans for funds to continue my work on antithrombin 3. So I ended up going in practice back at Cape Girardeau. Kay had lived there. I had a lot of friends there at this point. I continued to cave. Roger Brucker, Lynn Brucker, Tom Gratian, and Kathleen Dickerson we're outside the park, going into the Morrison Cave. Long, tough, difficult trips. And I participated in some of this. But my life changed a little bit when Nick Crawford, here he's talking to Richard Zopf, put together the courses for Western Kentucky University on these week-long summer courses at Mammoth Cave National Park. This is 1984. The classes were held at this time at the Great Onyx Pavilion. Art and Peg were here. I was here teaching historical geography of Mammoth Cave. Its name was soon changed. This was 1984, and last summer, 30 years later, I again had the privilege of teaching the class. Here's a recent class I just randomly chose, 2006. You'll see Maria Perez, you'll see Norman Warnell. Here's John Benton. From this angle, it's hard to see. Bill Dapper, Scott Cundiff, Glenn Ridgway. These were fun classes, but for me, they were always R&R from a busy medical practice of treating patients with cancer and diseases of the blood. This was my stress release, and here the university was paying me to teach a week-long summer course. We had fun. These are the bonsai ladders in Long Cave. When you get there, the students always enjoy climbing these. Now, back in Missouri, I was also active. Here we're rescuing a doctor out of a 135-foot deep Echo Pit, which is one of the entrances to Crevice Cave. He had been down there for 24 hours. He thought it was 120 feet deep. He had 120 feet of new rope. He put it down and alone tied off and went down. He got permission, and he got to the end, and he was just a foot or two off the floor. And so he let go, but he had bought dynamic, not static rope. So the rope went way back up 15 feet or more. We had I was involved in MMV Grotto activities. Here's the Weissbros on one of our trips to Harrington Cave. I started doing cave diving. We're studying typhlichthes here at this 212-foot deep pool in the Blue Gulf. It's a cave that goes back about 600 feet that's filled with typhlichthes. Now, in 1987, Tex Yoakum, our great friend and mentor, I was back caving with he and Mark Oliver. This is our last picture of Tex. He was dead several months later. Mark is dead 4 years later, and they're at the Mystery Cave entrance. After that, I went back and spent more time. This is what it's like under the city of Perryville. Big cave. I got more intrigued by the boundaries of the cave systems, the margins of the groundwater basins. Done a little dye tracing up at Columbia. This is a Baptist minister and his 12-year-old daughter, Joy. That's John Lewis. And we're in the backyard of a woman on the north side of Perryville, and it's called Dorothy Taylor Cave. It's a little hole. It was an arduous trip. And about a month later, I called John, who I'd been caving with in high school. I said, John, let's go back. We need to survey more Dorothy Taylor Cave. And he said, no, Stan, I can't go, but Joy wants to go. So I picked up Joy, and we had an attorney with us, Jeff McGuire, also passed away, a good caver, and other cavers, Rick Bennett, who's here, Howard Kolnitz, who's here. We spent a lot of time caving here, surveying out a mile of passage. And Joy went on a lot of that as she went through high school, later studied cave biology. The thing about once we mapped Dorothy Taylor, I mapped another nearby cave, and Ted Ballman Cave, and we, with dye tracing, proved that these were the far upstream ends of the Moore Cave system. And with that, I started doing much more dye tracing rather than hard cave trips. Dye tracing to define the about 6 groundwater basins in Perry County to try to figure out what's in the upper margins of these. Where are the drainage divides? And part of that work was then published in the master's thesis of Sue Schooler, who got her master's there at Southeast Missouri State. More caving in Missouri, right under a main bridge in the south side of Cape. Suddenly, all of Cape LaCroix Creek and Thanksgiving all disappeared in this hole under the bridge abutment to come out in a limestone quarry not far away. So the sons were there on their Thanksgiving vacation from college, and what did we do? We waded down, this water pouring on us, people thinking we're drowning, and inside it was actually a very nice walking cave. Back at the park, Thanksgiving in 1987, Kay and I was riding, there was no guide to the trails of Mammoth Cave National Park. I was hiking a cave called the Good Spring Loop Trail, 8.7 miles. Kay and I had stopped in the valley just to have lunch. And I saw this hole, and I went in, and it had an enormous blast of air. So we went back several months later and found that about 250 feet in of hands and knees or belly crawling, we ended up coming into a room nearly 70 feet tall. We came in the middle, and down below is this big stream. All this under the dry prong of Buffalo Creek. So about for the next 10 years at Mammoth Cave, most of my trips were here. You have water way over your head. After about 600 feet, you're out in beautiful caves, sometimes 100 feet wide. And so the next bunch of years, Sue is here. Hagen helped me on some of these trips. Mick Sutton's been surveying in here. We ended up surveying the 2.5 miles of Buffalo Creek Cave. It was all virgin when we were in there. Exciting caving on the north side of Green River in Mammoth Cave National Park. The trails guide that I was writing ended up finally coming out as a guide to the surface trails in Mammoth Cave National Park. All the money for this went to CRF. The ironic thing is I wrote it, Red Watson had a friend print it. Friends brought all these books, 3,000 books down to Cape on Saturday because I was on call at the hospitals on Sunday. On Saturday I drove them over to Mammoth Cave. The next day was like July 1st, and on the flatbed truck with senators and such, Roger Brucker, our CRF president, got to proudly present my book to the dignitaries as CRF's contribution for the 50th anniversary of Mammoth Cave National Park. Now, Kay and I in 1991 knew that at that point CRF was based at Maple Springs on the north side of the park. And we knew that this probably wasn't long-term going to work out. We already had a little acreage on the south side. We managed to buy an adjacent farm, and on the day we bought it, the landowner showed us this karst window that wasn't shown on the quad maps. He was trying to impress me with the spring. I kept saying, well, where's this hole go? Where does this hole go? He says, oh, no, that's nothing up here. Is the important thing. Here's the spring, because deer come down there and turkeys. You can shoot them. And so the Alan Cannon, James Wells from Louisville heard us talking about that, came down the following weekend. Richard Zopf and I had already poked at the hole a little. They came down and crawled in. And this is today what we call Sides Cave. Thanksgiving, they had mapped a little bit. Here's Howard Kolnitz. He's demonstrating now an important concept. This is how you try to tighten a very dirty chin strap. They're on a survey trip in which they were surveying a lot of the main half-mile or quarter-mile, I guess, probably nearly a quarter-mile entrance passage into Sides Cave, which once you get inside has a lot of upper dry passage. Here's James Wells coming out of the cave. Water pours into this entrance. You know, it's a real ear dip, but what you can't see is around the corner. Actually, it's a bit of a dry tube, and the water goes off to the side. This is Andy Free further back in the cave. The upper dry passage here continues on the other side of a valley as left of the trap or Miller Trail in nearby Crystal Cave. The canyon below him is 90 feet deep. We still have not explored all of these canyons. The lead list is nearly 100 leads. It's just difficult to go in and out of this. Well, on this acreage, there was a small little hole, and we dug and dug on it, and suddenly popped in to a little bit of going cave. And so we just called it, or it became named Stan's Well rather than cave. At first, we thought we were wasting our time digging where a little stream falls down, and the farmer years ago had used that as a water source. Here's Gary Bordeaux on the left, me in the middle, Norman Warnell on the right, heading in to do more micro shaving to follow this stream through a series of shafts. Now, at every 100 feet, 200 feet of cave is another 30-foot shaft. Then you go horizontally, another shaft. Norman Warnell, a really spectacular historian on the history of that area, and you can't fatigue him. He'll sit and use a Hilti hammer drill that will set charges, but we're on sort of belly crawling to where we blast. We go 10 feet away. We move more rock and tumble bug the rock, and we keep going until we got into very nice cave. Now, just to demonstrate that the famed Gordon Smith of Marengo Cave does occasionally go caving, Here's a clean Gordon Smith. Here's me, Norman Warnell, and Gary Bordeaux, and here's our little cabin over at right next to the Hamilton Valley facility. This was the day that we poked through the crawl and came out to New Year Junction, another 30-foot shaft, put down cable ladders and rope, and beyond. Of all things, we're in Walking Cave. Sometime later, John All, Joyce Hoffmaster, and me, we ended up digging out a crawlway and got into a very nice walking passage. Far back is a shaft, and I'm dangling there wanting Gary to take my picture quickly because it's about 45 feet below, and I have to swing over to get off to go in the nice walking passage. But that's called Stan's Well. My history interest has only become more piqued through the years, and teaching the classes made me need to keep up. This is a famed Russell Trawl Neville picture of Floyd. I needed to learn more about Floyd Collins' activities that we'd never studied. We have all this literature on him. Well, what else was there? There was something called natural tunnel, Floyd's natural tunnel. I asked Bill Austin about. CRF had dug it out once in 1964. I think Roger Brucker and others dug on that, Burnell Eamon. We went back and restored the entrance, dug out fill. And this is Floyd's natural tunnel. No one had taken pictures. No one could remember really the way this looked. A spectacular tunnel, very few names, but it quieted a bunch of rumors and mysteries about what natural tunnel consisted of. With that, I thought, well, the next is Floyd's Cave. After the talk, you'll decide why the president of CRF, the fifth that followed me, the famed Roger Brucker, doesn't have his pants on. Norman Warnell, Gary Bordeaux. We went over to Floyd's Cave. He initially called it Donkey's Cave, and it was his first commercial cave, commercialized about 1910 across the valley from where his family lived. He did have a little cabin built over this entrance. Here's John File further down. Deep down, Roger McClure or one of us would fill a bag with just fill that had accumulated, would pull it up, and then we'd drag it out of the sinkhole and dump it. Inside, we learned a great deal. Names had not been recorded before. Floyd actually had a walkway through the cave. It was really, really fun to follow. The upper passage is 900 feet of nice walking. Here I am just documenting the boards and the things Floyd had left in the cave. Diana Tomczyk and Art Palmer looking at one of Floyd's whiskey bottles. The importance of this is that 3 years ago, Joyce Huffmaster ended up crawling from shafts that we reached from the bottom of Floyd's Cave, ended up coming out in Pole Avenue. That was all in the NSS News. And so we've connected Floyd's Cave now into the Mammoth Cave system. We added that to the system with this connection. Now in 1967 or so, I went to a cave entrance, historically was the first entrance into Colossal Cave. It's called the Woodson Adair entrance. Famed history associated with it. I went there, I knew it was a vertical drop. We got there, it was hard to find. Went in but couldn't go very far. Stopped by about a 20-foot shaft further in and a filled passageway. Well, we went back. We kept working on it recently. No one was there I wasn't there between 1967 and about 2 years ago. We finally found a way around a shaft that was called the Shaft of Sighs. The tourists in 1895 had a walkway around it. And we ended up finding Spectacular Cave. Norman Warnell is here to safety us back up. Old rotted steps that they had used in commercializing it in 1895. John File, I'm here, Dan Greger, Dick Market. Behind us is the walkway that leads you to Colossal Dome, a spectacular way to cross and a very deep shaft. And then you would pop out in Colossal Cave. Well, in 1999, several of us, with our wives, bought Diamond Caverns. Larry and Mayo McCarty, Kay and me, Susan Bordeaux, Judy and Garden Smith, Roger McClure, Gary Bordeaux off to the side. Out of that, because the cave, and we're still owners of the cave, out of that I wrote the book, Diamond Caverns, Jewel of Kentucky's Underground, because the last book on diamond caverns had been written in 1870. Max Kemper's history, the enigma of all these names in Mammoth, led to one of our biggest successes as far as studying history, and that Max Kemper, who died in the Battle of the Somme in 1918, but produced the map of the Kemper map from 1908. We ended up finding his family in Germany, and they came to Mammoth Cave to see their grandfather's name in the cave. They had no idea he had done all this work in the cave. We did other places, Gary and I and Shane Fryer, John Andersland, going down in Fisher Ridge Cave. This is the way I today try to go through karst, bringing you up to date on my recent activities. This is Shelley Kolatsky, who may be in the room. We looked at the Belmont Railroad Tunnel in Bullinger County looking for bats, doing a winter bat determination. That was fun. There's caves off the side of this that need to be surveyed. Scott House and the rest of us are now looking at these caves, cave entrances under Perryville for the city of Perryville. I've become re-energized much of my interest in electronics using Brian Pease's design for his cave radio location units. These are the ones that I've built, and Brian and I were looking at these. Thanks, Brian, on Sunday night. So I still love caving, and if I have advice for you in your caving career, associate with an organization that has long-term agreements so that you'll be able to go back the same place for a long period of time. You may drop out for a while, but you'll go back. Also associate with really good people that you enjoy being with. This is my family. We're making new cavers. 2 are here today. So, many important mentors. This is Roger Brucker leaving for a cave trip here in the middle in probably a 1959 slide taken by Mickey Starts. It's the way it was back in the back of Floyd Collins Crystal Cave, 1959. I didn't get there until 1962. It's still a place with magic. That's a park. The caves are just still filled with magic. I want to thank all these fine people who, without knowing it probably, donated some of the slides here. Thank you. Are there questions? Because it's 2. Okay, meet me in the hall.
Thank you very much, Stan.
Sure.